morning of October 1st, 2025, began like any other summit day in Ouagadougou. Delegates from across Africa filled the Grand Hall of the African Economic and Security Summit, expecting speeches about trade, cooperation, and progress. But what they heard instead would shake the entire continent and send shockwaves far beyond its borders. When President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso rose to speak, the room fell silent. Cameras flashed. Heads of state leaned forward. No one could have predicted the words that would follow. With calm conviction and eyes steady on the audience, he declared that Africa would begin limiting its cooperation with China. For a moment, silence held the hall like a spell. Then whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. Journalists froze over their keyboards. No African leader in recent memory had spoken so directly, so boldly, about Beijing's influence. Traore's statement was more than policy. It was a declaration of independence. For decades, China had positioned itself as Africa's great partner. Roads, bridges, ports, and railways had carried the label, "Made with Chinese Investment." Billions of dollars flowed across borders in the name of friendship. But hidden behind the smiles and handshakes were debts, dependencies, and quiet fears. And now, for the first time, one young leader dared to call it by its name. His words echoed through the summit hall. "If we are not vigilant today, we will become the new colony of China." It was not a speech of anger, but of warning, not of rejection, but of awakening. Traore spoke for every farmer whose land was taken for foreign mines, for every student who studied under Chinese-funded scholarships, but returned to find no work, for every nation tired of trading sovereignty for loans. That single statement from Ouagadougou would soon travel far beyond Africa. Within hours, global media erupted. Headlines read, "Burkina Faso defies China." Analysts on every continent asked the same question. What pushed Africa to make this turn? As the sun set over the Sahel that evening, a sense of history filled the air. Something had shifted. The age of silent dependency was ending, and the age of African assertion had begun. The speech that shook the world was not shouted in anger. It was delivered in calm conviction. President Ibrahim Traore stood before the gathered leaders of Africa and outlined, step by step, why the continent could no longer depend on China. His message was not only for Burkina Faso. It was for every nation that had once believed that friendship came without a price. He began with a truth few dared to speak aloud. "The Belt and Road Initiative," he said, "is not a bridge to prosperity. It is a chain of debt." Between 2000 and 2020, Beijing had poured more than $150 billion into Africa through infrastructure loans. But those loans, Traore warned, came with hidden locks. When countries failed to pay, their ports, roads, and energy grids quietly slipped into foreign hands. He cited the haunting example of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, leased to China for 99 years after its debts could not be paid. That, Traore said, must never happen to Africa. His second point was even more direct. Africa's riches were flowing out faster than ever before. 70% of Congo's cobalt, 60% of Zambia's copper, and more than half of Angola's oil were bound for Chinese refineries. Beneath the surface of economic growth, he saw a slow bleeding of sovereignty. "We are exporting the veins of our land," he said, "and importing dependence in return." The hall grew silent. Even those who had signed major Chinese contracts knew he was right. Then came the warning that startled military observers around the world. Since 2017, China had stationed troops in Djibouti, at the very edge of Africa's eastern gateway. Officially, they were there for peacekeeping and logistics. But Traore asked a simple, unsettling question. When foreign soldiers wear the symbol of peace on African soil, who decides when peace ends? He reminded the audience that control often begins quietly, under the banner of cooperation. Finally, Traore spoke about the new frontier of control: technology. Huawei and ZTE had wired much of Africa with 4G and 5G networks. Surveillance systems built by Chinese firms were operating in Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. Cameras on street corners, data stored abroad, and silent monitoring of political activity raised a darker question. Was Africa trading one form of colonialism for another, not of land, but of information? The phrase that followed would echo across the continent. Our freedom cannot survive inside another nation's servers. By the time he finished, the room was heavy with tension. Some ministers looked down, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others nodded slowly, recognizing in his words a truth they had felt for years. When the applause finally came, it was hesitant at first, then growing into something deeper, a release of decades of silent frustration. But the story did not end there. Within days, Traore flew to Beijing. Cameras flashed as he entered the Great Hall, where China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Premier Li Qiang waited to meet him. The setting was polished, ceremonial, and heavy with expectation. For Beijing, this was a chance to ease the tension, to remind Africa of its gratitude. Officials spoke of friendship, of $200 billion in investments, of shared prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, the air was cold. When Traore finally spoke, his words were measured but firm. He looked across the marble table and said, "This is not friendship. This is golden trap." Those 7 words fell like thunder. The room froze. Chinese officials shifted in their seats. For decades, African leaders had chosen quiet diplomacy over confrontation. But in that moment, a 36-year-old president from a small West African nation stood taller than the world's second largest power. Beijing's reaction was swift. Within 72 hours, Chinese state banks delayed loans to Zambia and Ethiopia. Planned investments in Ghana and Mali were cancelled. Trade restrictions followed, a warning to any nation tempted to follow Traore's path. Yet what China saw as punishment, the Sahel saw as proof. Crowds in Ouagadougou filled the streets chanting his name. In Mali and Niger, officials praised his courage. Across Africa, something had shifted. Fear was giving way to pride. And as night fell over Beijing, one question echoed through every capital from Washington to Nairobi. Had Ibrahim Traore just triggered the most important realignment in modern African history? What would happen next? Would his defiance isolate Burkina Faso, or ignite a continental revolution for independence? The answer was already beginning to unfold. When the echoes of Traore's speech reached the streets of Ouagadougou, something extraordinary began to happen. Crowds gathered in front of government buildings, waving handmade flags, chanting not against a foreign enemy, but in celebration of a national awakening. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's people were not responding to a coup, a crisis, or an announcement from abroad. They were answering